Hello, everyone. This is Alexander Loki speaking. And I am about to present to all of you the importance of vocabulary in secondary language acquisition in reference to Krashen, a few other researchers, and the influence that vocabulary has on the developmental stages of proficiency. So, let's begin. I like this quote from Keith Fultz. He's a researcher on vocabulary, and he says, while without grammar, very little can be conveyed. Without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. One of the things I was thinking is what Krashen said in his 5 hypotheses from 1985 is how he separates learning from acquisition. And I do think that in a way, vocabulary can possibly tie these two together. And it's funny because in some respects, vocabulary is often overlooked, maybe for practical reasons like time, or even just making books on vocabulary. There are not many vocabulary weighted books. So this is where I pose the question, how can we tie together learning and acquisition together with vocabulary to enhance proficiency in other domains of SLA? And at what stages are these strategies useful? So let's keep moving. So one of the reasons that research is important to the field of SLA is that vocabulary encourages language acquisition in early stages, but it can also catalyze the language skills in intermediate stages of development and later galvanizes proficiency in the advanced stages of SLA. And what I mean by that is that in every stage of developing proficiency in secondary language acquisition, vocabulary plays a vital role, and it changes. And I looked at a bunch of research experiments and came up with a few. And one is Alice Johnson, Lisa Brown, and Yang and Wang. But Johnson essentially said that vocabulary works reciprocally with reading comprehension through a variety of usable strategies. That's in essence what her whole experiment is about. But what she says is that background knowledge of vocabulary works reciprocally with reading comprehension. Lisa Brown was saying that vocabulary is enhanced best through scaffolding. She calls out the traditional approach of understanding vocabulary and breaks it down into 2 different testing groups that we'll discuss later. And says that scaffolding can enhance long-term access to vocabulary and retrieval for production. And lastly, Yang and Wang, they worked with vocabulary and said it's a guide. Key vocabulary is a guide to comprehension when effectively highlighting the words in the meaning. And it brings together learning and acquisition and reading and listening. And that's what Krashen said. Why is it important for me? Well, I teach at Towson University, and I find it extremely important because I work with adults, and I work with all levels of proficiency with adults. And here I'd like to have, in a way, vocabulary to be my ace in the sleeve, if you will, for whichever class is thrown my way each semester. I think that the beginning stages of secondary language acquisition work best with vocabulary scaffolding, basic vocabulary, what have you, especially in situational contexts. Heavy inferencing leads to long-term vocabulary acquisition. Intermediate stages of SLA is more the comprehensible input that Krashen was talking about. And the advanced stages of secondary language acquisition, if I'm teaching my higher level students, just what vocabulary is necessary for them to pursue their careers. So let us continue. I'd like to break down some of the theories we discussed in class. And right here, Krashen's been a very vital pioneer in the understanding of secondary language acquisition. So we're going to talk about 3 of his hypotheses. One of the problems with vocabulary is that, I'm just going to read this, learners cannot find the proper word during communication. That's even happened to me when I was learning Spanish. Learners cannot express their feelings with the proper words. And that can go back to Odlin when she talks about the difference, or Terence Odlin when he talks about the difference between concept and meaning. Learners can also not produce what they've learned in their practice, and learners cannot identify the words when they're listening to others. Now, Krashen says that listening and reading are 2 of the most important parts for comprehensible input. He also states that you can separate acquisition and learning, but input is where the major strides are made. Now, some of the researchers we will discuss are Yang and Wang, and they show the importance of vocabulary as it ties together acquisition and learning. They cannot be used properly in actual verbal communication. The effective filter hypothesis is another hypothesis led by Krashen, and he says that the emotional factors of a student, motivation, personality, and their emotion, like anxiety, really play a fact in how they acquire the language regardless of learning. And Yang and Wang state, I'm going to quote them, that emotional factors have impacted the process of SLA. These emotional and affective factors have filtering functions upon language input. Therefore, the quantity of language input is determined. Emotional factors include motivation, personality, and emotional state. And we just discussed that. Now, Krashen's theory in the monitor hypothesis is something that all teachers should keep in mind. And that is that how can this student approach the language that's in front of him or her? Do they have enough time to study? Do they have the focus that they need to see the form or the correctness of what they're learning? And do they know the rules? All right. Rules kind of stick out with grammar, and this is where vocabulary is overlooked. But vocabulary can't be ignored because there are many moments in which collocations and colloquial terms and concept and meaning from vocabulary are vital. And if they don't know the rules of a vocabulary word, it can really hurt their learning and their acquisition. So these are some of the theories I want you to think about while we discuss some of the research that I researched. The first study I went into was Krashen's theory of SLA theories and the vocabulary teaching in college oral English.